servant who disappeared. The servant girl annihilator. Austin, Texas, 1884-1885. Before Jack the Ripper made headlines in London, a killer was already at work on the other side of the world. In Austin, Texas, between 1884 and 1885, someone murdered 8 people in their beds. They were never caught. Their identity remains unknown to this day, and almost nobody talks about them. This is the story of America's first suspected serial killer. Austin in the 1880s was a city trying to become something. The Texas capital had grand ambitions, new buildings, new money, a university. But beneath that progress, a quiet and brutal underworld operated in the shadows. And in the early hours of Christmas Eve, 1884, it announced itself. Molly Smith was a black domestic servant. She lived in a small outbuilding behind the home of her employers on West Pecan Street. At around 2 a.m, her neighbors heard screaming. By the time anyone investigated, Molly was gone. They found her in the yard, her skull caved in, her body dragged through the mud and left in the cold. She was 25 years old. Her boyfriend, Walter Spencer, was found injured nearby. Police arrested him. They were certain they had their man. They were wrong. 3 months later, it happened again. Eliza Shelley, another domestic servant, murdered in her sleep, an axe wound to the head. Her children were in the room. Then Irene Cross, then Clara Dick, then Rebecca Ramey and her 11-year-old daughter Mary. The killer did not discriminate by age. They struck in the dead of night, always with something heavy and blunt, and always with surgical certainty. Each time, police arrested someone. Each time, the killings continued. The press gave the unknown perpetrator a name, the servant girl annihilator. Most victims were black women working as domestic servants, and for months, Austin's African-American community lived in absolute terror. Women barricaded their doors. Families slept in shifts. But then, on Christmas Eve 1885, exactly 1 year after Molly Smith was killed, everything changed. The killer struck twice in one night, and this time the victims were white. Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, both killed in their beds with their husbands sleeping beside them. The city erupted. What had been treated as a problem for one community was suddenly everyone's crisis. Austin hired more police. They installed electric streetlights, one of the first American cities to do so, specifically to deter the killer. The mayor promised justice. And then the killing stopped. No arrest was ever made. No definitive suspect was ever charged. One theory, floated by criminologists decades later, was that the killer may have moved to London, and that the Austin murders bear striking similarities in method and pattern to the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. The idea remains unproven and contested, but it has never been fully dismissed. 8 people died. Dozens of suspects were questioned. Not one killer was ever identified. Austin got its electric lights. The victims got a footnote. Case 2, the body in the library. The misidentification of Mary Jane Barber, England, 1942. Agatha Christie wrote a novel called **The Body in the Library** in 1942. In it, a young woman is found dead in a country manor, and the mystery hinges on a case of mistaken identity. What almost nobody knows is that the same year the book was published, something eerily similar happened in real life, and the case went unsolved for decades because investigators trusted the wrong identification. Carolyn Ann Rawnsley was reported missing from Bournemouth in the summer of 1942. Around the same time, an unidentified woman's body was found on a golf course nearby, burnt almost beyond recognition. Police matched the two. Case closed. The body was identified as Rawnsley, buried, and the investigation ended. The problem, Rawnsley turned up alive years later. The woman on the golf course was never actually identified with certainty. She had simply disappeared into the administrative machinery of wartime Britain, where record-keeping was chaotic, people moved constantly, and the dead were processed quickly. The case was resurrected by cold case investigators in the 1990s, who realized the original identification had been based on little more than timing and assumption. Dental records from the era were incomplete. Fingerprints had degraded. The woman buried as Carolyn Ronsley may have been someone else entirely, and her real family may never have known what happened to her. The story is a reminder that wrongful identification doesn't only happen to the living. It happens to the dead, too. And when it does, two injustices occur simultaneously. One family mourns someone who isn't their person, and another family never gets to mourn at all. The woman on the golf course has never been conclusively identified. Hash Case 3, the man who wasn't there. Hash the disappearance of Brian Schaffer, Columbus, Ohio, 2006. Brian Schaffer was 27 years old, a medical student at Ohio State University, and by all accounts, a man with everything ahead of him. On the night of April 1st, 2006, April Fool's Day, he went out with friends to celebrate spring break. He was last seen on security camera footage entering a bar called Ugly Tuna Saluna in Columbus, Ohio. He never came out. That's not a figure of speech. Every exit from the bar was covered by surveillance cameras. Investigators reviewed every second of footage. Brian Schaffer walked in. Brian Schaffer never walked out. Not through the front door, not through the back, not through any fire exit. His phone went to voicemail. His car was still in the parking garage. His girlfriend, Alexis Walagora, waited for him to come home. He didn't. Police interviewed everyone at the bar that night. They spoke to staff, patrons, and friends. They reviewed hours of footage from surrounding businesses. Nothing. The official conclusion was that he had somehow exited through an area under construction that wasn't covered by cameras, a gap in the surveillance net. But nobody saw him leave. Nobody saw him on the street outside. Nobody saw him anywhere ever again. Brian's father, Randy Schaffer, spent the rest of his life searching for his son. He hired private investigators. He followed leads across multiple states. He never found him. Randy Schaffer died in 2008 without knowing what happened to Brian. There are three broad theories. The first is that Brian had a mental health crisis and walked away from his life voluntarily, living under a different name somewhere. The second is that he met with foul play inside or near the bar, and his body was concealed. The third, favored by investigators, is that he exited through the construction zone and died by suicide, his body undiscovered in a location that wasn't searched. None of these theories have ever been proven. Brian Schaffer remains a missing person. His case is open. His girlfriend eventually moved on, married, and has spoken publicly about the lingering grief of never having closure, of not knowing whether to grieve or to hope. The cameras at Ugly Tuna Saluna recorded everyone else going home. They recorded Brian going in. The rest is silence. Hash Case 4, the woman who predicted her own death. Hash the murder of Diane Schuler, New York, 2009. This case is unusual, not because of a murder committed in the dark, but because of a tragedy that unfolded in broad daylight and the years-long investigation into what caused it. On July 26, 2009, a minivan drove the wrong way down the Taconic State Parkway in New York for nearly 2 miles before colliding head-on with an SUV. 8 people died. The driver, Diane Schuler, her daughter, her 3 nieces, and 3 men in the other vehicle. Diane's son survived. He was 4 years old. Diane Schuler was 36, a mother and corporate manager described by friends and family as responsible, sharp, and capable. She didn't drink. She didn't use drugs. She was not, by any account, someone who would drive drunk with children in the car. The toxicology report shattered that image completely. Diane's blood alcohol level was 0.19, more than twice the legal limit. She also had a significant amount of THC in her system. She had been drunk and stoned while driving with 5 children. But here, where it gets complicated. Her husband, Daniel Schuler, refused to accept the results. He called the toxicology report wrong. He hired his own investigators. He spoke publicly and repeatedly about his belief that something medical had caused her behavior, a stroke, a brain event, something that mimicked intoxication. A documentary was made. He maintained this position for years. What the documentary uncovered and what it didn't intend to was deeply unsettling. Witnesses who spoke to Diane at a rest stop shortly before the crash said she was clearly disoriented, slurring, and confused. Her brother, who had been traveling with the group and left his daughters in Diane's care, said she had seemed fine. The timeline of alcohol consumption was never fully established. When she drank, whether anyone knew, none of it was ever resolved. The case raises questions that still generate debate. Did someone close to her know she had a drinking problem and say nothing? Was there a family secret that sent 5 children to their deaths? And why, in the weeks before the crash, had Diane made a comment to a friend that she sometimes felt like she just wanted to disappear? The crash was ruled an accident. No criminal charges were filed. The families of the men in the other vehicle sued Daniel Schuler for negligence, alleging he knew about Diane's drinking and did nothing. 8 people are dead. No one was ever held accountable. Case 5, buried twice. The case of John Doe B. 29, California, 1980 to 2015. In 1982, the body of a young man was found in the Angels National Forest north of Los Angeles. He had been shot. He was estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old. He had no identification. He had no dental records on file. He had no one to claim him. He was buried in a county cemetery as John Doe B. 29. He stayed there for 33 years. In 2015, a forensic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, the same woman who would later help identify the Golden State Killer, began working through a backlog of unidentified remains using new DNA technology. John Doe B. 29 was one of hundreds of cases on the list. The process of identifying an unknown person using DNA is painstaking. You extract a genetic profile from the remains. You upload it to genealogy databases. You look for distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, and then you build a family tree backward and forward until you find a branch that had someone go missing at the right time, in the right place, at the right age. In John Doe B. 29's case, the DNA matched a family with roots in the American Southwest. The genealogist built a tree. She found a branch. She found a name. The young man was identified as a runaway who had left home in the late 1970s. His family had reported him missing. They had searched. They had eventually, painfully, given up hope. When investigators arrived at the home of his now elderly mother to deliver the news, she had been waiting for 33 years to know what had happened to her son. She had kept his photograph on her mantelpiece. She had never stopped talking about him. The case remains open as a homicide investigation. The person who shot him has never been identified. But at least he has a name now. At least his mother knew. John Doe B. 29 was exhumed and reburied in a family plot, with a headstone with his real name. He was buried twice, once as a stranger and once as someone's son. Case 6, the murder that built an empire. Herman Webster Mudgett, Chicago, 1893. When Chicago was awarded the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, what history remembers as the World's Fair, the city went into a frenzy of construction. Millions of people would descend on the city. Hotels were needed. Commerce would boom. And into this gold rush stepped a man who called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. He had trained as a doctor, though he had left a trail of fraud, theft, and suspicious deaths behind him in various cities before arriving in Chicago. But nobody in Chicago knew that. What they knew was that he was charming, brilliant, and determined. Holmes built a hotel on the corner of 63rd and Wallace. He designed it himself. Workers noticed the unusual specifications: false walls, doors that opened onto brick gas pipes that ran into sealed rooms, a chute that led from the upper floors to the basement. Holmes explained everything away. He fired workers constantly and hired new ones so that no single crew would understand what they were building. The hotel opened for the World's Fair. Guests checked in. Many of them were never seen again. In the basement, investigators later found a dissection table, an acid pit, a large kiln, human bones. Holmes had used his hotel as a killing machine, luring victims in, sealing them in airtight rooms, and gassing them. He sold their skeletons to medical schools. He collected life insurance on them. He was meticulous, methodical, and completely without remorse. After the fair ended, Holmes fled. He committed fraud in Texas, Fort Worth, and Philadelphia. He killed more people, including 3 children of a former business partner. He was eventually arrested in Boston in 1894 on a horse theft charge, of all things, and investigators following that thread pulled the whole rotten structure apart. Holmes was convicted of the murder of his business partner Benjamin Peitzel. He confessed to 27 murders. Historians believe the true number may be higher. Some estimates reach over 100, though this is disputed. He was hanged on May 7, 1896. He requested that his coffin be filled with cement, reportedly fearing that grave robbers, the same kind he had sold bodies to, would steal his remains. His hotel was demolished. The site became a post office. The number of people who walked into that building and were never seen again is still not known. Some of them are buried in records. Some are buried nowhere at all. Holmes is often cited as America's first documented serial killer. He operated entirely in the open, charming, professional, respected, while building a machine of death beneath the most celebrated event in the country's history. The World's Fair drew 27 million visitors. Nobody noticed. Case 7, The Children Who Vanished. The Beaumont Children, Adelaide, Australia, 1966. Australia Day, 1966. Adelaide. A city so safe that children still walk to the beach alone. Jane Beaumont was 9, Arna was 7, Grant was 4. Their mother, Nancy, put them on a bus to Glenelg Beach at 10:10 in the morning. She told them to be home for lunch. She expected them back by midday. They never came back. What followed was one of the largest searches in Australian history, and one of the country's most enduring mysteries. Witnesses reported seeing the 3 children at the beach that morning, apparently in the company of a tall, thin blonde man in his late 30s or early 40s. They seemed comfortable with him. They were seen buying food at a local shop, buying more than they could have afforded with their own pocket money, which suggested the man had given them money. And then they disappeared. The father, Jim Beaumont, spent the rest of his life searching. He received thousands of letters, followed thousands of leads, and was tormented by frauds and con artists who claimed to know where the children were. A Dutch psychic named Gerard Croiset flew to Australia and claimed he could find the children's bodies in a warehouse under construction. Thousands of people watched as the site was excavated on live television. Nothing was found. Croiset returned to the Netherlands. Over the decades, several men became prime suspects. One was Arthur Stanley Brown, who was convicted in the 1970s of abducting and murdering 2 young girls in Queensland in a strikingly similar manner. Brown died in 2002, never charged with the Beaumont case, and never clearing his name of it. In 2018, a man named Derek Percy, a convicted child killer who had died in prison, was named as a person of interest after investigators concluded he had been in Adelaide around the time the children vanished. Percy had never confessed to the Beaumont killings, but had made cryptic references to them over the years. Nothing has been proven. No remains have ever been found. Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont have never been officially declared dead, though their parents are now both gone. The case reshaped Australia. Within years, the country's easy, open attitude toward children playing unsupervised began to shift. Glenelg Beach, once a symbol of summer freedom, became something else. 3 children walked into an Australian summer and were never seen again. 60 years later, nobody knows what happened to them. Case 8, the house on KDZIE Avenue. The murder farm of Belgunnis, Lawport, Indiana, 1908. Belgunnis placed personal advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest. She described herself as a widow, prosperous and kind, seeking a partner to share her life and her farm. She asked respondents to be financially secure. She asked them to come prepared to invest. They came. They brought their money. They were never seen again. Belle Gunnes was a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived in America in 1881. By the time she settled in La Porte, Indiana, she had already collected substantial insurance payouts on the deaths of 2 husbands and several children. Each death had been ruled accidental or natural. Each had made her wealthier. At her farm on the outskirts of La Porte, she received suitor after suitor. Men who had responded to her advertisements. Men who had told friends and family they were going to Indiana to meet a woman who might become their wife. Men who had liquidated their savings. In April 1908, a fire burned the farmhouse to the ground. In the ashes, investigators found 4 bodies, 3 children, and a headless adult woman initially presumed to be Belle herself. But as investigators searched the property grounds, they made increasingly horrifying discoveries. Dismembered remains, wrapped in burlap, buried across the farm. Piece by piece, they identified the victims, the men who had answered Belle's advertisements. By some estimates, more than 40 people were murdered on that property. The headless body in the ashes was never conclusively identified as Belle. Her dentist provided a bridge that was found at the scene, but almost immediately there were questions about its authenticity. Ray Lampher, a farmhand, was convicted of arson but denied killing Belle or the children. He died in prison, reportedly telling a fellow inmate that Belle had escaped. Sightings of Belle Gunnes were reported for decades. A woman matching her description was arrested in California in 1931. She denied being Belle. The charges were dropped. She disappeared again. Belle Gunnes was never captured, never tried, never confirmed dead. The bodies in her yard were real. The woman in the fire may or may not have been her. If she survived, she was one of the most prolific killers in American history, and she walked away. Case 9, the Zodiac's last known letter. The Zodiac Killer, California, 1969-1974. The Zodiac Killer sent 37 letters to newspapers and investigators over a period of several years. He included ciphers. He included pieces of victims' clothing. He included taunts. He gave himself a name and made sure everyone used it. And then, in 1974, he sent what appears to have been his last letter, and he stopped. The Zodiac is confirmed to have killed 5 people in Northern California between 1968 and 1969. He claimed 37 in his letters. Investigators believe the true number is somewhere in between, possibly 10 to 15. But without more confessions, more evidence, or a confirmed identity, the exact body count will never be known. The confirmed cases: David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, shot at a lover's lane near Vallejo in December 1968. Darlene Ferrin and Michael Majo at a parking lot in July 1969. Majo survived. Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell, stabbed at Lake Berryessa. Hartnell survived. Paul Stein, a taxi driver, shot in San Francisco. After each attack, the Zodiac wrote, he sent ciphers in 3 parts to 3 different newspapers, demanding they be published on the front page or he would kill more. The newspapers complied. The police were publicly humiliated. The killer delighted in it. A partial cipher sent in November 1969, called the 340 cipher for its length, was not cracked for 51 years. In December 2020, a team of amateur codebreakers from the United States, Australia, and Belgium finally solved it. The message read, in part, I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise. The most heavily investigated suspect in the case was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted sex offender and schoolteacher from Vallejo. Investigators spent years building a circumstantial case against him. Witnesses placed him at key locations. His behavior matched known facts about the killer. He owned a Zodiac brand watch, whose logo resembled the crosshair symbol the killer used as a signature. Allen was never charged. He died in 1992. DNA testing on the back of stamps and envelopes used in the Zodiac letters yielded a partial profile, but it didn't match Allen or any other known suspect. The Zodiac's last confirmed letter, sent in January 1974, contained references to a film he had apparently just seen and complained about news coverage. It was oddly mundane, the letter of a man who had grown bored with the game, or who felt the game had ended. Nobody was ever charged. The Zodiac case remains officially open in every jurisdiction where a murder occurred. The ciphers are still only partially solved. Case 10, The Vanishing Village. The Lost Colony of Roanoke, North Carolina, 1590. This one reaches back further than most, not to the 20th century, but to the 16th. To a mystery so old that it has become mythology, but that was, at its core, a true crime of almost incomprehensible scale. The disappearance of an entire community of over 100 people. In 1587, a group of English settlers landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They were sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh, part of England's early and fractious attempts to establish a permanent presence in the New World. The colony was to be self-sustaining. It was to be the beginning of something. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies almost immediately after arrival, leaving behind more than 100 men, women, and children, including his own daughter and his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. White was delayed in England for 3 years, partly due to the war with Spain and the threat of the Armada. When he finally returned to Roanoke in 1590, the colony was empty. The houses had been dismantled. The palisade walls were still standing. There were no signs of violence, no bodies, no blood, no evidence of a battle. On a fence post, the word Croatoan had been carved. On a tree nearby, the letters CRO. White believed this was a message, that the colonists had moved to Croatoan Island, home to a Native American people of the same name who had been broadly friendly to the English. But a storm prevented him from reaching Croatoan Island, and he was forced to return to England. He never went back. No subsequent expedition found the colonists. No remains were ever definitively linked to the lost colony, though in recent years, archaeological work has uncovered a possible campsite on the mainland that may be connected. The theories are numerous. Assimilation with native communities, death from starvation or disease, massacre by a neighboring tribe, a Spanish attack from Florida. None has been proven. What is known is that more than 100 people, including children, including a newborn, simply ceased to be where they were supposed to be. And the only clue they left was a single word carved into wood. The lost colony of Roanoke remains one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in American history. Virginia Dare, if she survived childhood, would have grown up somewhere in the Americas as someone whose story was never told. Case 11, The Doctor Who Killed with Kindness. Harold Shipman, Hyde, England, 1998. He was known as a good doctor, caring, attentive, the kind of GP who made house calls, who sat with elderly patients, who held their hands. Harold Shipman murdered at least 215 of them. The confirmed death toll from the Shipman inquiry, a public investigation following his conviction, placed the number at 215. The inquiry's chair, Dame Janet Smith, stated she believed the true figure was closer to 250. Some estimates have gone higher. Shipman is the most prolific confirmed serial killer in British recorded history. He killed his patients with lethal overdoses of diamorphine medical heroin. He had access to it as a GP. He would visit a patient, administer the injection, wait for them to die, and then call the time of death, often claiming they had passed away peacefully just before he arrived. He frequently altered records after their deaths to suggest they had been in poor health. For over 20 years, nobody noticed. There was one near miss. In 1998, a local GP named Linda Reynolds became suspicious about the number of elderly patients in Shipman's care who were dying and the number of death certificates he was signing. She reported her concerns to the local coroner. An investigation was opened and then quietly dropped. No further action was taken. Kathleen Grundy was a former mayor of Hyde, active and healthy at 81 years old. She was found dead in her home in June 1998. Shipman had been her doctor. He had visited her that morning. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a solicitor When she discovered that her mother's will, a new will, had been altered to leave everything to Harold Shipman, she didn't accept it. She hired her own investigators. She had her mother exhumed. The toxicology report found fatal levels of diamorphine in Kathleen Grundy's tissues, still detectable despite the time since her death. Shipman was arrested. What followed was one of the most shocking revelations in British medical history. As investigators reviewed death records, a pattern emerged that spanned decades. Patient after patient, almost all elderly women, dying in the afternoons, sitting in a chair or on a couch, fully dressed, the signature of Shipman's method. He would inject them while they sat, and their bodies would simply relax into position. He was convicted in January 2000 of 15 murders. The inquiry confirmed hundreds more. Shipman never explained himself. He never confessed. He never expressed remorse. He was transferred to Wakefield Prison, and on the morning of January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, he was found hanging in his cell. He took his reasoning to his grave. We still don't know why. We still don't know how many he killed before the pattern was noticed. The inquiry concluded that the medical system had no adequate mechanism to detect what he was doing, and recommended sweeping changes to death certification procedures in the United Kingdom. 215 confirmed victims, possibly more. A whole town's worth of elderly people who trusted their doctor. Hash Case 12, the man in the dunes. Hash the Provincetown murders, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, 1969-1974. Cape Cod in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a complicated place. A summer haven for the wealthy, a year-round home to working fishing communities, and increasingly, a gathering place for young people drawn by the counterculture. Hitchhikers, runaways, free spirits. People who moved without itineraries. People who weren't always missed when they disappeared. Between 1969 and 1974, the bodies of 8 young women were found in the dunes and scrublands around Provincetown at the tip of the Cape. They had been dismembered, their remains scattered. Some were never fully identified. All had been killed with the kind of methodical calm that investigators associated with someone experienced, someone organized, someone local. Tony Costa was a handyman and local drifter, known to many in the Provincetown community. He was arrested in 1969 after the remains of 2 young women, Patricia Walsh and Mary Ann Wysocki, who had met him just days before their deaths, were found buried in the woods near his garden, where he had been growing marijuana. Costa was convicted of 2 murders and sentenced to life in prison. He died by suicide in 1974. But investigators never confirmed whether Costa was responsible for all 8 deaths. The crimes that occurred before and after his confirmed killings followed a similar pattern. Some of the victims had been in contact with him. Others hadn't, or at least, no contact could be established. Author Kurt Vonnegut was living in Cape Cod during the period of the murders. He spoke publicly about the impact the crimes had on the community. The way a small, tight-knit place could be hollowed out by the knowledge that something terrible had happened, repeatedly, in the dunes you walked through every day. The unidentified victims remain unidentified. The exact scope of Costa's crimes remains uncertain. And the Provincetown dunes, beautiful and bleak in equal measure, still hold whatever secrets were buried there. Hash Case 13, the death of the beautiful cigar girl. Hash the murder of Mary Rogers, New York, 1841. Mary Rogers worked in a tobacco shop on Broadway in New York City, and she was famous. Not in the modern sense, no broadcasts, no photographs, but famous in the way that only happened in small cities before mass media. Everyone who passed through Lower Manhattan seemed to know her face, and the shop's regulars made special trips just to see her. On Sunday, July 25, 1841, Mary Rogers told her fiancé, Daniel Payne, that she was going to visit an aunt in New Jersey. She didn't come back. 3 days later, her body was found floating in the Hudson River near Hoboken, badly beaten and showing signs of assault. Her clothing was torn. A strip of her dress had been tied around her neck, suggesting it had been used to drag or move her. A coroner's examination suggested she had been alive when she entered the water. The investigation was chaotic. New York's police force was barely a year old. The press descended. Newspapers competed to offer the most dramatic coverage, and in doing so, contaminated the public record with rumor and fabrication so thoroughly that separating fact from fiction became nearly impossible. Daniel Payne, her fiancé, was suspected briefly. He later died near the site where Mary's body was discovered, officially ruled a suicide, though some considered it suspicious. A gang called the Daybreak Boys was implicated, then cleared. A boarding house owner in New Jersey, a woman named Frederica Loss, made cryptic statements on her deathbed about what had happened in the thickets near her establishment, but died before making a clear confession. Edgar Allan Poe was living in New York at the time and became obsessed with the case. He wrote a short story called ***, The Mystery of Marie Rogert***, transposing the details to Paris with a fictional detective. It was the first detective story in history to be based on a real unsolved crime. Poe believed he had identified the killer, and the evidence he laid out pointed toward an illegal abortion that had gone fatally wrong, performed near Frederica Loss's boarding house. Poe's theory was never proven. It remains one of the most credible explanations, but it is still only a theory. Mary Rogers was 21 years old. She has been dead for nearly 200 years. Her case has never been solved. She is remembered now mostly because Poe wrote about her. Whether that is a comfort or an irony depends on how you look at it. Case 14, the confession that took 40 years. The BTK killer, Wichita, Kansas, 1974-1991. He named himself. That was part of how he worked. He sent a letter to a Wichita newspaper in 1978 and asked them to call him BTK, bind, torture, kill. He wanted a name. He wanted credit. He wanted to be known. And then, inexplicably, he went quiet for years at a time. He disappeared into ordinary life. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 in Kansas. He served in the Air Force. He married. He had 2 children. He worked in compliance, literally going door to door to enforce city ordinances on dog licensing and trash disposal. He was president of his church congregation. He was, by all visible measures, a normal man leading a normal life. Between 1974 and 1991, he murdered 10 people. He murdered the Otero family in their home, a father, mother, and 2 of their 4 children, bound and strangled. Their youngest daughter hanged from a pipe in the basement while Rader watched. He murdered a woman named Catherine Bright while her brother fought him and survived, the only witness to ever see BTK and live. He murdered Shirley Vian in front of her children, locking the children in a closet first. He murdered Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wedgerl, and Dolores Davis. After each murder, he wrote. He sent letters, poems, riddles, diagrams. He drew pictures of his victims in bondage. He wanted to be caught, or rather, he wanted to be known without being caught, which is a different thing. He went silent after 1991. For over a decade, investigators assumed he had died, or moved, or stopped. They didn't know he had simply grown comfortable. In 2004, the 30th anniversary of his first murders brought renewed media coverage, and that coverage reawakened something in Rader. He began communicating with police again, sending packages, asking whether a floppy disk could be traced. Police told him it couldn't. They were lying. He sent a floppy disk. It contained metadata linking it to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita and to a user named Dennis. The rest moved quickly. He was arrested in February 2005. He was 60 years old. He had grandchildren. At his sentencing, Rader described his crimes in clinical, almost academic language, referring to his victims by letter codes and describing the murders as projects. He showed no remorse. He seemed to enjoy the courtroom's attention. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his crimes. His wife, Paula, said she had no idea. Their marriage was, by her account, ordinary. She filed for divorce immediately after his arrest. Dennis Rader is still alive in a Kansas prison. He continues to write letters to journalists, to investigators. to true crime enthusiasts who write to him. He still wants to be known. Case 15, The Girl in the Box. The kidnapping of Colleen Stan, California, 1977-1984. Colleen Stan was 20 years old when she accepted a ride from a couple she had just met. She was hitchhiking to a birthday party in California in 1977, and Cameron and Janice Hooker seemed safe. They had a baby in the car, and Cameron had kind eyes. What followed was 7 years of captivity. Cameron Hooker was a deeply disturbed man who had spent years building a custom wooden box, approximately the size of a coffin, designed to fit under a bed. He had studied isolation and psychological control. He had convinced his wife, through a combination of manipulation and a shared obsession, to participate in what he intended as a long-term project of total human domination. Colleen was driven to a remote California town. She was placed in a rigid head box, a wooden device worn around the skull that blocked all light and most sound, whenever she was transported. She was kept in the wooden box under the bed for up to 23 hours a day, for years. She was subjected to systematic abuse and psychological conditioning designed to make her believe she could never escape. The most remarkable and disturbing element of the case is what happened after several years of this. Colleen was allowed more freedom. She got a job. She jogged. She wrote letters to her family. She did not tell anyone what was happening to her. Hooker had convinced her that she was under contract to a powerful organization called the Company that monitored her every move and would kill her family if she tried to leave. There was no company. It was a fiction, but to Colleen, conditioned by years of isolation and trauma, it was as real as anything. She finally left in 1984 after a conversation with Janice Hooker, who by then had grown disillusioned with her husband's obsessions and disclosed some of what had happened. Colleen went home to her family. She didn't initially tell them what had occurred. She was still, in some sense, not free. It was only when Janice Hooker, racked by guilt, went to police that the full story emerged. Cameron Hooker was tried in 1984 and convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping and related charges. He was sentenced to over 100 years in prison. Colleen Stan wrote a book about her experience. She has spoken publicly about the nature of coercive control and why victims don't run, even when running seems possible. Cameron Hooker was paroled in 2015 after serving 30 years. The decision was met with outrage. Colleen Stan is still alive. She rebuilt her life. Her story remains one of the most extraordinary and difficult to comprehend cases in the annals of American crime, not because of its violence, but because of what it reveals about the human capacity to endure and the human capacity to break. Case 16, Nobody Knows Her Name. The Black Dahlia, Lowe's Angels, 1947. January 15, 1947. A woman walking near a vacant lot in the Lamert Park neighborhood of Lowe's Angels notices what she initially takes for a discarded store mannequin in the long grass. She looks again. It was the body of Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She had been posed, her body placed with deliberate care, arms above her head, body bisected cleanly at the waist, completely drained of blood. Her face had been slashed in a wide grin from the corners of her mouth toward her ears. Whoever killed Elizabeth Short had done so somewhere else and transported her there. The crime scene itself offered almost nothing forensic. What it offered instead was spectacle, and the Lowe's Angels press, in the most ruthless media market in America, turned it into a sensation within hours. A Lowe's Angels Examiner reporter called the Short family home, pretending to be from the Red Cross, and obtained personal information about Elizabeth before informing them of her death. The paper then ran the story as an exclusive, using details obtained through deception. It was one of the most unethical acts in American journalistic history, and it set the tone for what followed. Elizabeth Short was dubbed the Black Dahlia, a name she never knew and didn't deserve. The press reconstructed her life and in doing so, invented large parts of it. She was variously described as a prostitute, a drifter, and a troubled loner. Much of it was false. She had been working in restaurants and as a waitress, trying to save money, living between cities. She had a fiancé who had died in the war. The investigation produced over 150 suspects over the years, including some who confessed voluntarily. Most were dismissed. Several were credible. The most researched theory in recent decades centers on a Lowe's Angels surgeon named George Hodel, whose son, retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel, spent years after his father's death building a case against him. George Hodel had been investigated briefly in connection with the case in the 1940s, but never charged. Steve Hodel's evidence, published in a 2003 book, included a photograph found in his father's belongings that appears to show Elizabeth Short, and handwriting comparisons that he argued matched taunting letters sent to police. George Hodel died in 1999. He was never charged. Elizabeth Short has been the subject of films, novels, podcasts, and countless theories. She is arguably the most famous murder victim in American history, and yet she remains unidentified in the most important sense. The person who killed her has never been identified. Her death has never been solved. The spectacle of the case has, in a way, consumed the actual crime. Whoever posed her body in that vacant lot wanted people to look. They succeeded beyond any possible expectation, and they walked away completely free.